The late afternoon sun draped long amber lines across the cracked frontier soil as Clyde Harrow stood rigidly beside the crooked wooden gate of his lonely homestead, the worn matrimonial agency letter trembling slightly between his fingers, its creases soft and frayed from countless nights spent imagining the gentle, delicate woman it promised him, someone shy, grateful, and in need of the very protection Clyde had always believed would make him feel like a real man. He rehearsed a polite greeting under his breath, adjusting his vest, wiping his palms on his trousers, trying to steady the nervous flutter in his chest as the distant rattle of wagon wheels grew louder. And when the horses finally slowed and the wagon rolled to a dusty halt before him, Clyde straightened his back, inhaling deeply only for that breath to snag halfway in his throat as the driver pushed aside the canvas flap and the figure inside rose. First, a large hand gripping the wooden frame, then a broad shoulder, then a silhouette expanding upward until she towered beneath the wagon's canopy, her height impossible to ignore, her posture unyielding, her movements controlled with a quiet precision that suggested experience in far harsher places than this barren patch of land. The woman stepped down into the sunlight, as the documents would later confirm, a striking presence with dark golden eyes that assessed Clyde not with shyness or fragility, but with a steady, composed calm, her long braided hair threaded with turquoise and bone, her leather clothing marked with geometric patterns he did not recognize, and Clyde felt something inside him crumble, not in fear of her, but in fear of what her existence meant for the fantasies he had built around marriage. He forced himself to speak, his voice cracking slightly as he introduced himself, and Kaya simply nodded once, accepting the information without ceremony, her silent confidence making him feel simultaneously smaller and strangely safer, though he did not have the language to understand why. The driver, anxious to depart, shoved the finalized contract into Clyde's hands and drove off, leaving a thick, uncomfortable quiet behind, broken only by the wind brushing against the dry grass. Clyde, heart thudding in unsteady rhythm, gestured awkwardly toward the house, stumbling over his words as he tried to present it proudly, despite knowing how cramped and fragile it now appeared beside Kaya's imposing presence. And as she ducked beneath the doorway and examined the interior, her expression did not twist with judgment, as Clyde feared it remained calm, analytical, as though she were measuring the space not for comfort but for possibility. Inside, she unpacked a modest bundle of belongings, with deliberate care tools, clothing, a small carved figure, while Clyde hovered uselessly nearby, wrestling with the realization that nothing about her suggested she needed rescuing or dependence of any kind, and the insecurity that swelled inside him felt hot and childish, exposing how deeply he had equated being needed with being worthy. As twilight dimmed the corners of the room, Kaya finally broke the silence with a simple, steady statement. I agreed to this union. We will learn each other. And Clyde nodded, unable to form a coherent response, struck by the unfamiliar honesty in her tone, which lacked both romance and distance, resting instead in a space of grounded truth he wasn't sure he knew how to inhabit. And later that night, as he lay awake, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of Kaya's breathing from the adjoining room, Clyde realized with a strange, aching clarity that this woman, this towering, self-reliant stranger, was not the wife he had prayed for. but she might be the one he needed to finally confront the hollow spaces inside himself. He had spent so long trying to fill with an imagined version of love. Night settled over the homestead like a heavy curtain, the air cooling fast as the last streaks of red bled out of the sky, and Clyde found himself moving through the cramped single-room house with the awkwardness of someone suddenly aware of every flaw, every creaking board, every patch of wall where the wind whispered through. Kaya stood near the fireplace, her silhouette solid and unmoving, examining the room with quiet calculation rather than displeasure, her eyes lingering briefly on the lone bed before shifting to the floor, as if measuring where she would lay her blanket. And Clyde, mortified by the realization that his preparations had been built around a much smaller, more delicate woman, stumbled over apologies he couldn't fully articulate when for Kaya to cut through his flustered words with a simple, grounded statement, "I sleep by the fire tonight." Her voice held no resentment, only practicality, though the sentence struck him like a reprimand, a reminder that he had written letters asking for a wife, yet had not prepared himself for what marriage actually required. He watched her unroll a blanket with swift, practiced movements, selecting a spot where the stone hearth would radiate warmth through the night, and he felt a tightness coil in his chest, a guilt that clung to the edges of his thoughts as he realized he had invited a stranger into his life, with no understanding of who she was or what she needed, expecting gratitude instead of partnership. When she took out dried meat from her bag rather than accept his simple stew, Clyde felt another wave of discomfort. Was she refusing his hospitality, or simply relying on her own provisions out of habit? He couldn't tell, and the uncertainty made him feel even more like a boy pretending at manhood. They ate in silence, the crackling fire masking the awkward shuffling of dishware, and Kaya's calm presence filled the small room far more completely than any noise could have. She seemed content, observing, absorbing, studying the shapes and sounds of a space that had been Clyde's lonely sanctuary for 3 long years, and part of him felt exposed, almost invaded, yet another part felt steadied by her nearness, as though something larger than him had stepped across his threshold and silenced the restless echoes that used to fill the nights. When she finally lay down, turning her face to the wall with the serene composure of someone accustomed to unfamiliar places, Clyde retreated to his bed, but sleep evaded him. Instead, he found himself listening to the subtle cadence of her breathing, its steadiness a foreign comfort that tangled with his confusion, just as drowsiness finally began to pull him under. A soft sound cut through the dark, the faint shift of fabric, the sudden cessation of Kaya's breathing pattern. Clyde cracked his eyes open just enough to see her sitting upright, gaze fixed sharply on the door, body tensed with instinctive alertness, one hand resting near something inside her bag. She wasn't afraid, she was ready, like a sentinel watching the night for dangers Clyde had never even learned to imagine. He pretended to sleep, unsettled by the quiet intensity of her vigilance, and when dawn finally seeped through the window, he awoke to find her blanket neatly folded, the door slightly ajar, and Kaya already outside, greeting the sunrise with raised palms, murmuring words he could not understand. The sight filled him with an unexpected mixture of wonder and inadequacy, as though he were witnessing something sacred he had no right to interrupt. And when she returned, carrying the scent of sage with her, She offered no explanation, nor did he ask for one, feeling instinctively that whatever ritual she practiced belonged to a part of her life, untouched by contracts or homestead walls. The morning began with a quiet so heavy it felt like another presence in the room, and yet something in Clyde sensed, with vague and growing clarity, that the first night had not been a failure, but a beginning, an uncomfortable, humble, necessary beginning to a marriage neither of them fully understood, but both had stepped into with more honesty than he had expected. The early morning light stretched across the dusty fields as Clyde approached Kaya with a hesitant mixture of curiosity and dread, watching her roll up her leather toolkit with a practiced efficiency that suggested she had already taken stock of his land and found it lacking. He opened his mouth to offer her breakfast, but she was already striding toward the sagging fence line with long, purposeful steps, and he scrambled to keep up, feeling strangely like a guest on his own property as she knelt beside the first leaning post, pressing one strong hand against the wood until it shifted with humiliating ease. "How long has this been like this?" she asked without looking at him, and Clyde felt heat crawl up his neck as he muttered something about 2 or 3 seasons. Long enough that he had stopped seeing the problem. Long enough that he had convinced himself it wasn't as bad as it truly was. Kaya stood, dusting her hands off. "This is not repairable. It must be replaced." Her bluntness stung, not because she was wrong, but because she was right in a way he had never allowed himself to be. He swallowed his pride and admitted he didn't have enough lumber for full replacements, only to watch her drop to one knee again and begin digging around the base of the post with a sharp-edged tool he had never seen before. "Then we make do with what we have," she replied, voice steady, movements fluid. "Strength can come from many places." Clyde crouched beside her, trying to mimic her technique, but his hands felt clumsy and uncoordinated, his efforts shallow compared to the deep, sure motions she carved into the earth. She noticed, of course, without even looking fully at him. "Work smart, not desperate," she murmured, reaching past him to reposition the spade in his grip. "Your arms are fighting the tool. Let it do its work." Her fingers brushed his knuckles, firm yet patient, and something in Clyde's chest stuttered an unexpected flicker that made him straighten too quickly, almost dropping the handle. Kaya's eyes lifted to him for a brief moment, unreadable, then returned to the task without comment. They worked in a silence that felt different from the heavy awkwardness of the night before. This silence had purpose, rhythm, a quiet merging of effort as they reinforced the post with stones she selected by size and weight, creating stability where none had existed. As the sun climbed higher, Clyde found himself sweating through his shirt, breath coming hard, while Kaya moved with unrelenting steadiness, her strength seemingly carved from the desert itself. Yet she never flaunted it, never used it to shame him. Instead, when he struggled to lift a stone she handled easily, she spoke gently. "I do not measure you by my abilities, only by your willingness." The words sank deeper than he expected, loosening a knot he hadn't known existed. By midday they had reinforced 4 posts, the fence noticeably straighter, stronger, more improved in a morning of shared labor than in his entire past year of efforts alone. And Clyde felt a quiet pride blooming beneath his exhaustion, a pride that came not from proving himself to Kaya, but from working beside her, matching her pace as best he could. But when Kaya suddenly paused, her gaze snapping toward the horizon, Clyde followed her line of sight. "Storm coming," she said, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. Clyde blinked. "There's not a cloud in the sky." Kaya's jaw tightened slightly. 2 hours, maybe 3, and though her voice remained calm, something in it carried a weight he instinctively trusted. As they walked back toward the homestead, Clyde noticed details he had ignored before: the stillness in the air, the absence of birdsong, the faint metallic temps on the windband. A ripple of unease slid through him. Inside, Kaya began securing shutters, gathering tools, organizing the house with swift, decisive motions that made Clyde realize how unprepared he had been to live alone, let alone protect someone else. And as the wind shifted, warm and wrong, carrying with it the first whisper of something fierce on the horizon, Clyde felt the ground shift inside him to be. 'Cause today had shown him something he was not ready to admit, that Kaya was not merely adjusting to his life. She was reshaping it, strengthening it, post by post, truth by truth, in ways he desperately needed but never knew how to ask for. By the time the first unnatural gust of wind swept across the dry earth, Clyde had already begun to regret doubting Kaya's instincts. Because the sky, clear and painfully blue only an hour before now, darkened at the edges, like bruised skin spreading across the horizon, and the air grew thick with a strange pressure that made his ears ring and his breath come shorter. Yet Kaya worked without pause, moving through the homestead with swift, precise efficiency as she secured loose shutters, dragged tools inside, shifted furniture to brace the weaker walls, and Clyde followed her lead in a flurry of scrambling motion, realizing with a growing sense of humility that she understood the language of the land more fluently than he ever had. When the first low growl of thunder rolled across the sky, long before any clouds hovered overhead, Clyde felt the hair on his arms stand up, and Kaya's voice cut through the rising wind, steady and commanding. "Roof first, help me reinforce it before the gusts rip it open." They climbed up the uneven ladder together as the wind began to shove against the house like a living creature, and Clyde's heart hammered with a mixture of fear and awe, both at the storm forming with terrifying speed and at the calm determination in Kaya's movements as she knelt at the weakest section of the roof, pressing her palms to the patched boards as though measuring their chances of survival. He tried to steady the planks with shaking hands while she nailed them down in powerful, rhythmic strikes, each motion sharp and sure, and he could feel the roof tremble beneath them as the horizon shifted into a churning wall of deep violet, clouds streaked with lightning so bright it flashed even through daylight, illuminating Kaya's face for a split second, fierce and focused. "Down," she suddenly shouted, grabbing his arm with a grip that brooked no argument as a violent gust slammed into the house, tilting the structure just enough to make the ladder sway dangerously. They climbed down as fast as they could, and the moment their boots hit the dirt, the storm crashed into the land with roaring force, wind howling like an injured beast, and rain slicing sideways through the air like thrown gravel. Inside, Clyde threw his weight against the door as it rattled against its hinges, while Kaya moved swiftly around the room, patching leaks with cloth, wedging furniture against unstable points, her motions fluid even as the house groaned under the storm's assault. She called, pointing to a spreading dark patch where rain was forcing its way through the roof. And together they climbed onto the table, pressing a thick blanket against the widening gap as water spilled down in cold, sharp rivulets. Their shoulders pressed together in the cramped space. The storm's fury shaking the house so violently, Clyde nearly lost his balance, but Kaya held firm, her breath steady despite the chaos. When thunder cracked directly overhead, the noise hit Clyde like a physical blow, and he flinched instinctively, but Kaya didn't move, only tightened her grip on the makeshift patch and spoke calmly through the noise. "Do not freeze push with me." Her voice anchored him, pulling him back into motion until the blanket finally held, slowing the leak to a faint drip. But just as relief flickered inside him, another beam creaked ominously on the opposite wall, and Kaya was already there, shoving the table and motioning for Clyde to help brace it. They leaned their full weight against the trembling structure as rain hammered the roof with blinding intensity, lightning turning the room white for a heartbeat, thunder following instantly, shaking dust from the rafters. Minutes or perhaps hours, Clyde couldn't tell, passed in a blur of straining muscles, shallow breathing, and Kaya's calm commands guiding him through every threat, every shift in the house's bones, until at last the storm began to ease, its screams fading to a distant rumble while rain softened into steady tapping, and Clyde sagged against the wall, drenched, exhausted, and trembling from a fear he hadn't realized he'd been carrying for years. Fear of being alone in a world that didn't care whether he stood or fell. And as Kaya checked the house one last time, ensuring it would hold through the night, Clyde watched her with a dawning awareness that she had not only protected the home, she had protected him, in ways he had never known how to protect himself. The storm had barely passed when Clyde noticed the first sign that something else, something human, something dangerous, had moved through the land while they had been trapped inside. A single boot print in the mud, too deep, too deliberate, sitting just outside the barn, as if whoever made it wanted to be seen. And when he knelt to touch the edges, the print was still sharp, fresh enough that the rain hadn't softened it. Kaya appeared behind him with a quiet steadiness, her gaze immediately sharpening at the sight, and she muttered something in Apache under her breath, a word Clyde didn't know, but its weight made his stomach knot. She scanned the distant horizon, where storm clouds still crawled away in heavy layers, then motioned him inside the barn with a gesture that was swift but gentle, almost protective. Once the doors were shut behind them, Kaya spoke in that low, controlled tone she used only when danger was close. "This print belongs to a man who tracks for a living, one who follows storms because they wash away trails." Clyde swallowed hard, the barn suddenly feeling too small, too dim, and he asked who she thought it was, but Kaya didn't answer immediately. Instead, she knelt near the horses, running her hand along their necks, where she found dust that wasn't from their land, fine, red grit from the southern ridges, a place Clyde had never dared to ride. "He passed here during the storm," she said, standing again with a slow breath, "because even thunder cannot hide him from me." Clyde tried to gather his courage, though his hands trembled despite himself, and finally he asked the question that had been building since the moment he'd first seen Kaya step off that wagon. "Are they hunting you?" Her silence lasted only a second, but the weight of it, pressed against the barn walls, like the storm all over again. Then she nodded, just once, a sharp, resigned motion. Not me alone, she said. My brother, my tribe, anyone who refuses to kneel. She walked past Clyde toward the barn doors, lifting the latch just enough to peer outside before closing it again. They are government trackers, ex-soldiers turned bounty men. The words chilled Clyde straight to the bone because he'd heard stories quiet, whispered tales passed in saloons about men like that who hunted with military precision, who crossed borders no one else dared approach, who didn't care who else suffered as long as they got paid. Clyde's mind churned with fear. But Kaya spoke again before panic could take hold. Do not fear them for my sake, she said, meeting his eyes with a calm steadiness that held him in place. Fear them because they believe you harbor me willingly. The realization hit Clyde like a hammer. These men wouldn't see him as an innocent bystander. They'd see him as a collaborator, a traitor, someone who needed to be broken until he revealed her whereabouts. His breath hitched, but Kaya moved closer, pressing her palm against his chest, grounding him in the same steady way she had during the storm. Listen to me, she said. I will not allow them to touch you. Something inside Clyde cracked, not from fear, but from the intensity of those words, the fierce protectiveness in her voice. Before he could speak, Kaya went on, explaining how these men operated, how they used storms and shadows to hide their movement, how they staked out homes for days before striking, how they set traps using fear as bait. Clyde always knew danger existed in the world, but hearing it laid out in Kaya's low, unwavering tone made it feel terrifyingly real. And yet, even as dread swirled inside him, something else began to take root: a raw, unexpected resolve. If they're coming, he said quietly, then we face them together. Kaya's expression softened for the first time since the storm, not into a smile, but into something deeper, something proud. She nodded, touching his shoulder with a lingering firmness. Together, she echoed. But as they stepped out of the barn, the fading storm clouds parted just enough for Clyde to see silhouettes on the far ridge, small, distant, motionless, watching.